The chaplain called on a Monday morning while I was driving to work. His name was Father Miguel Ortega, and he said he was calling from Cedar Ridge Correctional Facility in eastern Oregon. He asked if I was Catherine Hayes. I said yes. He asked if I had a son named Ryan Hayes. I said my son died 12 years ago. There was a long pause. I heard papers rustling. Then he said, "Mrs. Hayes, I have a young man here who insists his name is Ryan Hayes and that you're his mother. He's been incarcerated for 8 years. He's asked to speak with you." I pulled over to the side of the road. My hands were shaking. I said, "That's not possible. My son died in a car accident in 2012. He was 17. Father Ortega said, "I understand this must be shocking. He has specific information. Your full name, your address from 12 years ago, details about his childhood. He's very insistent. Would you be willing to speak with him?" I said, "Who identified the body?" He said, "I'm sorry?" I said, "When my son died, who identified his body?" He said, "I don't have that information. But I can arrange a phone call, or you can visit the facility. He's asked for you specifically." I said I'd call him back. I sat on the side of the highway for 20 minutes, staring at the dashboard. Ryan had been my only child. His father, Michael, and I had divorced when Ryan was 10. Michael had moved to California, remarried, started a new family. Ryan had stayed with me. We'd been close, or I'd thought we were. Teenage years had been difficult, but we'd managed. The accident happened on a Friday night in November. Ryan had borrowed my car to go to a friend's house. He'd been hit by a drunk driver on a rural road outside Bend. The car had rolled. The police said he'd died on impact. Michael had flown in from California to identify the body because I couldn't bring myself to do it. The funeral had been closed casket. I'd buried him in a cemetery near my parents' plot. I visited every few months, less often as the years went on. I was 51 now, a nurse practitioner at a family clinic. I lived alone in a small house with a garden I barely tended. I'd rebuilt my life slowly, carefully, learning to live with the absence. And now a chaplain was telling me someone in prison claimed to be my son. I called Father Ortega back that afternoon. I said I'd visit the prison. He scheduled it for the following Saturday. I drove 3 hours east, through high desert and sagebrush, until I reached Cedar Ridge. The facility was low and sprawling, surrounded by chain, link, and razor wire. I checked in at the visitor's entrance. They took my IDs, searched my bag, and led me to a visitation room. It was a large space with tables, bolted to the floor, and guards stationed at the corners. I sat down at the table they assigned me and waited. 10 minutes later, a door opened and an inmate walked in. He was thin, tattooed, with a shaved head and a rough, weathered face. He moved slowly, like someone who'd learned not to make sudden movements. He sat down across from me. He looked at me with eyes that were the wrong color. Hazel, not Ryan's blue, but the same shape, the same focus. He said, "Mom?" I said, "Who are you?" He said, "I'm Ryan." I said, "My son is dead?" He said, "No, I'm not." I stared at him. I said, "Ryan had blue eyes. Yours are hazel." He said, "Contacts. I wore colored contacts back then. You bought them for me because I thought they looked cooler." That was true. I'd forgotten about the contacts. I said, "When did you start wearing them?" He said, "Freshman year." "You took me to the optometrist in Bend. You weren't happy about it." I begged. I felt my throat tighten. I said, "Why are you in prison?" He said, "Armed robbery. I was 19. Stupid. Desperate. I got 8 years." I said, "Ryan would be 29 now." He said, "I'm 29. I said, "How did you end up here?" He said, "I ran away after the crash. I didn't die, Mom. I survived. But I let everyone think I didn't." I sat back. I said, "Explain." He took a breath. "The crash was real. I was driving. But it wasn't me who died. There was someone else in the car. Kid I'd picked up hitchhiking. We were both drunk. When the car rolled, he didn't make it. I got out. I was hurt, but I got out. And I panicked. I saw what happened, and I just ran. I thought if I came back, I'd go to jail for killing him. So I disappeared." I said, "And you let me believe you were dead?" He nodded. "I know how that sounds. But I was 17 and terrified. By the time I realized what I'd done, it was too late. You'd already buried someone. I thought if I came back, it would destroy you. I said, "So you stayed gone," he said. "Yeah," I said, "for 12 years. He said, "I'm sorry." I said, "Who was the boy who died?" He said, "I don't know." He was hitchhiking on the highway. He didn't tell me his name. He was maybe a year older than me. He had no ID on him. I guess they assumed it was me because it was my car. I said, "Michael identified the body." Ryan looked down. "I know. I heard about it later." "I'm sorry he had to do that." I said, "Why now? Why are you telling me this now?" He said, "Because I'm getting out soon. Parole hearing in 6 months, and I couldn't walk out of here without you knowing I was alive." I stood up. I said, "I need time." He said, "I understand." I left. I drove home in silence. I didn't cry. I didn't feel anything except a strange, hollow numbness. When I got home, I pulled out the old photo albums. I looked at pictures of Ryan as a child, as a teenager. I tried to see the man in the prison in those photos. I couldn't. I called Michael. We hadn't spoken in years. He answered, surprised to hear from me. I told him everything. The call from the chaplain, the visit to the prison, claimed that Ryan was alive. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, "That's not possible." I identified his body. I said, "How closely did you look?" He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Did you see his face clearly?" He hesitated. The body was badly damaged. His face was, they said it was him. They matched his height, his build, the dental records. I said, "Did they actually check dental records?" He said, "I don't know." I assumed they did. I said, "I need to know for sure." He said, "Catherine, this is insane. You're telling me you believe this guy." I said, "I don't know what I believe. I need to find out." I contacted the county medical examiner's office. I explained the situation, that someone claiming to be my son had come forward, and I needed to verify the identity of the body we'd buried in 2012. The clerk I spoke to sounded skeptical, but said she'd pull the file. She called me back 2 days later. She said the identification had been based on a visual confirmation by the father, and the fact that the victim was found in Ryan's car with no other ID present. No dental records had been checked. No DNA test had been performed. I asked why not. She said, it was 2012. DNA testing wasn't standard procedure for traffic fatalities unless there was reason to question identity. The family confirmed it was him. I said, "What if it wasn't?" She said, "Then we have a significant problem." I requested an exhumation. The county required a court order. I hired a lawyer, a family attorney named Joanna Prescott, who specialized in estate disputes. I showed her everything: the chaplain's call, the prison visit, the medical examiner's report. She said, "If your son is alive, this is going to unravel everything. Are you prepared for that?" I said, "I need to know the truth." She filed the petition. The court scheduled a hearing. In the meantime, I went back to the prison. I needed more information. Ryan met me in the same visitation room. This time I brought a list of questions. I asked him to describe our house from when he was growing up. He described it perfectly, down to the crack in the kitchen tile and the loose board on the back porch. I asked him about his childhood. He told me stories I'd forgotten. A camping trip we'd taken when he was 8. A fight we'd had about curfew when he was 16. The name of his childhood dog. I asked him about the night of the crash. He said he'd been drinking at a party. He'd left around 11. He'd picked up the hitchhiker on Highway 20. They'd only driven a few miles before the drunk driver hit them. He said he'd crawled out of the wreckage, seen the other boy's body, and panicked. He'd walked to the nearest town and disappeared. I said, "Where did you go?" He said, "Portland, at first, then Seattle. I lived on the streets for a while, got into drugs, got into trouble. By the time I was 19, I was robbing convenience stores to survive. That's how I ended up here." I said, "Did you ever think about coming home?" He said, "Every day. But the longer I stayed gone, the harder it got. I convinced myself you were better off thinking I was dead than knowing I'd become this." I said, You took that choice from me. He said, I know. The exhumation hearing took place 3 weeks later. Joanna presented the case. The prisoner's claim, the lack of forensic verification in the original identification, the possibility of mistaken identity. The county's attorney argued that exhumation was expensive and unnecessary, that the original identification had been sufficient. The judge reviewed the file and said, given the circumstances, I'm granting the order. We need to verify the identity of the deceased. The exhumation took place on a cold morning in March. I wasn't present. Joanna called me afterward. She said, they've recovered the remains. They're sending them for DNA testing. I asked how long it would take. She said, 6 to 8 weeks. The wait was unbearable. I went through my routines, work, groceries, sleep, but I felt like I was moving through fog. Ryan called me from prison twice. The chaplain had arranged phone privileges. The first time, I didn't know what to say. The second time, I asked him if he was scared. He said, off what? I said, off the DNA results. Of what happens if it's not you in that grave? He said, I know it's not me. I'm here. I said, what if I can't forgive you? He said, I don't expect you to. The results came back in early May. Joanna called me at work. She said, the DNA doesn't match you or Michael. The person buried in that grave is not your son. I sat down. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. She said, they're running the DNA through a missing person's database. It'll take time. They might be able to identify who it actually is. I said, so Ryan's been alive this whole time? She said, yes. I drove to the prison that weekend. Ryan was waiting in the visitation room. When I sat down, he looked at me differently. Not hopeful, just resigned. I said, the DNA results came back. It's not you in that grave. He nodded. I told you. I said, who was he? The boy who died. He said, I don't know. I've been thinking about it for 12 years. I never knew his name. I said, someone's been looking for him. Someone's been grieving him. He said, I know. I said, you let me grieve you. He said, I'm sorry. I said, I don't know if sorry is enough. He said, I know. The DNA came back with a match 2 months later. The boy in the grave was identified as Tyler Moss, a 17-year-old runaway from Idaho who'd been missing since 2011. His mother had filed a missing persons report, but he'd never been found. The county contacted her. She came to Oregon to claim his remains. I didn't meet her. I didn't know what I'd say. Ryan's parole hearing was scheduled for August. Joanna helped me prepare a statement. I didn't know if I'd attend. In the end, I did. I sat in the hearing room and listened to Ryan speak. He talked about his crimes, his regret, his plans for reintegration. He didn't mention me. The parole board asked if any family members wanted to speak. I stood up. I said, Ryan is my son. He made terrible choices. He hurt me in ways I'm still processing. But he's alive, and I don't want to lose him again. They granted his parole. He was released in October. I picked him up from the prison. We didn't talk much on the drive home. I'd prepared the guest room. He moved in quietly. We don't have the relationship we used to. We can't. Too much time has passed. Too much damage has been done. But we're learning. Slowly, carefully. He got a job at a warehouse. He goes to AA meetings. He checks in with his parole officer. He lives quietly, like someone trying not to take up too much space. I visit Tyler Moss's grave sometimes. I bring flowers. I don't know why. Maybe because someone should. I think about the choices Ryan made. To run, to hide, to let me believe he was dead. I think about the 12 years I spent mourning someone who was still breathing. I don't know if I'll ever fully forgive him. But he's here. And that has to mean something. If you've ever had to rebuild trust with someone who let you believe the worst, if you've ever had to choose between anger and grace, you're not alone.